This is a video on active and passive voice, particularly examples. So the context for active and passive voice is that it's not grammatically incorrect, but it's a stylistic choice. And writers usually privilege the active voice over the passive voice. In order to identify the difference between active and passive voice, you have to be able to identify the verbs of the sentence. And you need to be able to think about the subject and the object of the sentence. So English is what's called a subject-verb-object language. That is, most sentences in the English language are usually expressed as subject, verb, object. So an example would be the dog ate the burger. So the dog is the subject, ate is the verb, and burger is the object. So the subject performs the action of the verb. Verbs are usually actions. They can also be states of being, like to be and to have. And then the burger is the object, that the subject eats the object. Okay? What happens in passive voice is that these things get reversed. So the object comes first, and then we have the verb, and oftentimes the subject can be left out. It doesn't have to be left out, but it can be left out. So in the object-verb subject rewriting of that, the burger was eaten by the dog, we see that the order has been reversed. And writers generally agree that the active voice is clearer and more direct, which is why they privilege it. So you want to pay attention to who does what in the sentence and make sure that you have the subject doing the action, and if there's an object, doing the action to the object. So what happens when the subject gets left out is you get a very short sentence, just like the burger was eaten. And this is where the passive voice can be vague because we don't know who did the action. The burger was eaten. Was it the dog? Was it the child? Who was it? Okay. So the active voice gives the actor the action, and that's the important thing to understand. So if you're not sure about how to identify verbs, go read the relevant sections in the essay writing textbook, which will help you understand how verbs function. We can't go through all the parts of speech in a short video like this. So what I'm going to do is put up 3 different examples and talk about each example. So as I put it up, I invite you to pause the video, and think, is this active or is it passive? By asking who does what and in what order is the subject, verb, and object of the sentence. And then start the video again, and I will explain the answer to you. So the first example is this. The desire by Swift in a modest proposal for better food, clothing, and housing is expressed. Pause it if you want and think about it. This sentence, as it's written, is passive. Okay? The verb is express, and we have to ask who or what does the expressing. Well, it's Swift. Swift does the expressing. The desire cannot express anything, it's just desire. So the way to rewrite this correctly would be to say, in a modest proposal, Swift expresses the desire for better food, clothing, and housing. Okay. The second example, here it is. Their house was bombed during the war. Pause it, figure out if it's active or passive. This example is passive. Why? What's the verb? The verb is bombing. Who or what does the bombing? We don't know. Was it a plane? Was it some crazy guy? Was it a cat? I don't know. So we don't know. So this is an example where the actual subject has been dropped. We just know that their house was bombed. An object was bombed. The house was bombed. Who did it? Well, we don't know. The subject is missing. So if we wanted to rewrite this into the active voice, we would need to think about the situation and put the appropriate subject. So if we took the Second World War as our context, we could say the Germans bombed their house in the Second World War. If we want to take the context of Afghanistan, we could say Americans bombed their house during the war. Okay? So this is why passive voice often needs more context. The third example is this. Skilled helicopter pilots lifted terrified flood victims from their rooftops. Active or passive? Pause the video. This one is active. Why? What's the verb? Well, they lifted the flood victims. Lifting is the verb. Who did the lifting? It was the pilots. The pilots lifted the victims. So this is active with the subject, verb, object. Pilots lifted victims. So this one's an active voice. Okay. So again, I invite you just to think about active and passive voice, do little mental exercises of thinking about activities and saying, how would I say this active? How would I say this passive? And just get comfortable, switching them around. Again, they're not grammatically wrong, passive voice, but stylistically they can sometimes be a problem. Now you might ask yourself a little bit, who cares? Why does this matter? It has the same information, active or passive, usually. Why is that something that we should pay attention to? Well, here's another example that we could look at. Indigenous people were treated badly in history. Is that active or passive? Well, it's passive because the verb is treated. Who did the treating? Okay. We know who was treated badly. We know the object was Indigenous people. They were treated, but who treated them badly? And this is where something like the passive voice can take on kind of political or moral or ethical ramifications. Because when you say, oh yeah, those people were treated badly, well, by whom? And as soon as we start assigning agency to the bad treatment, well, who treated them badly? Was it, in the contemporary context, let's take white people, settler colonials coming over from England or France or something. Okay, we just recently in Canadian history saw the toppling of a Sir John A. Macdonald statue, right? That he, in history is a complicated figure, okay? And we see different opinions, arising from the John A. Macdonald treated Indigenous people badly. And now we've actually ascribed responsibility for that treatment to a particular person. And we can see that opinions vary on that. Oh, you have to understand him in context, or he was racist, or, and different things come out of this. But if we just say Indigenous people were treated badly, people are like, yes, they were. And there's no responsibility whatsoever ascribed to that. And so it's a very politically neutral kind of statement to make. They're treated badly. No one's going to disagree with that. But when we start adding agency in, it can become a problem. And so we want to be aware of this, that when we make statements, that we want to be as clear and direct and as full of context as we can in order to make accurate statements and not kind of beat around the bush or fudge around with history or whatever the case may be. So on the one hand, yeah, it's just a grammatical exercise and you should understand this and control your style, and that's fine as far as it goes. But it's also important to understand when and why we might slip into the passive voice to gloss over things that might be important for context or for a larger, more complete discussion of a particular topic.